Imagine for a second that you are just completely, utterly exhausted.
Like bone tired.
Right. You have been stuck in this grinding, horrifying stalemate for 4 long years.
Mm.
Every single day is a miserable fight for literal inches of muddy, cratered ground.
You're just surrounded by rusted barbed wire.
Yeah, and the constant deafening roar of artillery that it shakes your bones.
It's that overwhelming feeling that this nightmare is simply never going to end.
Because the lines on the map, they really haven't meaningfully moved since the war began.
Not really, no.
And then suddenly, in a single morning, everything changes.
The static horror of World War I trench warfare is just blown wide open.
In one massive, devastatingly coordinated strike, we are talking about an 11-kilometer breakthrough in a matter of hours.
Which is just staggering.
It is. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking our stack of sources, the historical records, the diaries, the tactical maps, and we're heading to the Western Front.
Specifically, August 8th, 1918.
The Battle of Amiens.
It truly stands as one of the most dramatic, momentum-shifting moments in early 20th century history.
Our mission today, as we synthesize these sources, is to really understand the mechanics of this sudden shift.
Right. We want to break down how the Allies managed to shatter that seemingly unbreakable stalemate.
And deliver a blow so profound that it became forever known as the Black Day of the German Army.
We are going to look at the deception, the technology, and honestly, the sheer human endurance that made it possible.
The level of secrecy and the complex coordination we're seeing in these documents, it's astonishing.
It is.
When you read through the timelines, it feels less like a traditional military campaign and more like, I don't know, a high-stakes heist.
Yeah, like a heist movie, but executed with hundreds of thousands of troops.
Exactly, and hundreds of armored tanks and this unprecedented web of multisensory deception.
It requires asking how an entire army essentially vanishes into thin air.
Right, only to reappear exactly where the enemy least expects them.
The scale of that deception is staggering, especially when we place it within the broader context of the spring and summer of 1918.
Because both the Allied and Central Powers were just completely spent after years of attritional warfare.
Exactly. But the strategy implemented at Amiens didn't merely break the physical trenches.
No, it completely broke the psychological will of an entire empire.
And to understand how an army that has held firm through years of unimaginable bombardment suddenly watches its lines evaporate in a single morning.
We have to examine the profound exhaustion and desperation that preceded it.
Right. I want you, the listener, to keep that psychological state in mind as we go through this. Put yourself in the boots of those soldiers witnessing this impossible breakthrough.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's look at the gritty reality of the Western Front in the early months of 1918.
Good place to start.
To grasp the magnitude of the Amiens breakthrough, we first need to understand the terrifying position the Allies found themselves in just a few months prior.
It was incredibly bleak.
According to the strategic overviews in our sources, in early 1918, Germany suddenly possessed this massive, albeit temporary, advantage in manpower. How did they suddenly get this massive influx of troops?
Well, that influx ties directly back to the geopolitical collapse happening on the opposite side of the continent.
In Russia.
Exactly. The Russian Empire had fallen to revolution, and the new Bolshevik government signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers.
And that treaty formally ended the war on the Eastern Front.
Right. And for the German High Command, this was a monumental windfall.
Because they suddenly had upwards of 50 divisions.
Hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened...
Immediately loaded these forces onto trains.
Rushed them directly to the Western Front in France and Belgium.
It fundamentally shifted the balance of power overnight.
It really did.
The Allies had been fighting a two-front war, relying on Russia to keep German forces occupied in the east.
But with Russia out, all that German military might was now pointing directly at the British and French lines.
But the sources also indicate that the German leadership knew this advantage came with a very strict expiration date.
They were acutely aware of the ticking clock across the Atlantic.
The Americans.
Yes. The United States had entered the war, and American troops were actively mobilizing, training, and beginning to arrive in France in ever-increasing numbers.
Every passing week meant the American Expeditionary Force was growing stronger.
The German leadership, particularly General Erich Ludendorff, understood that their numerical superiority was strictly temporary.
He was a desperate gamble.
They had to launch a decisive war-winning offensive to crush the British and French before the American manpower tipped the scales permanently and irreversibly against them.
That sets the stage for Operation Michael.
Launched on March 21st, 1918.
The objective was to drive a wedge between the British and French armies, push the British back toward the English Channel,
And essentially knock them out of the war entirely.
But Operation Michael was merely the opening salvo.
It was the first in an exhausting series of overwhelming massive attacks known as the German Spring Offensive.
The German command utilized these highly trained shock troops, right?
The Stoßtruppen.
Right, the stormtroopers, to bypass strong points and infiltrate deep into Allied lines.
Following Operation Michael, they launched Operation Georgette in April, Blucher York in May, Gneisenau in June, and the Marne offensive in mid-July.
They were throwing the absolute totality of their resources at the Allied lines.
Desperately searching for that one critical weak point that would shatter the front.
And reading through the operational maps, one of their absolute primary targets during these offensives was the city of Amiens.
Amiens was crucial.
It wasn't just a dot on the map. It was situated in the Picardy region of northern France, and it served as the logistical heart for the Allies in that sector.
A vital railway junction.
Exactly. In an era where you needed trains to move millions of artillery shells, coal, and troops.
Losing Amiens would have been catastrophic.
If the Germans took that rail hub, they could sever the critical supply lines that connected the French armies in the south to the British armies in the north.
The stakes were existential for the Allies.
If Amiens fell, the British Expeditionary Force could have been entirely cut off from its French allies and pinned against the sea.
But the German advance, despite its initial ferocity and deep penetrations, was finally brought to a halt.
At a small town called Villers-Bretonneux,
just a few miles east of Amiens, by determined defense from British and Australian troops in early April.
The Germans continued to push elsewhere along the front, bleeding themselves dry, but they never captured Amiens.
And they never achieved that final decisive breakthrough.
It brings to mind a very specific scenario. Think of a fighter who knows they are behind on the scorecards.
Okay.
So in the final rounds, they pour every single ounce of their remaining energy into a massive flurry of heavy punches.
Swinging wildly.
Right, trying to secure a knockout. But if the opponent manages to cover up and survive that flurry, the attacking fighter is going to be completely gassed out.
Their arms will be heavy, their lungs burning.
They will have absolutely nothing left in the tank to defend themselves.
That mirrors the state of the German army by the end of their Marne offensive in July 1918 perfectly.
The German war machine had completely exhausted itself.
Their manpower reserves from the east were spent. Their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point over the newly captured, cratered terrain.
And the surviving troops were starving, demoralized, and physically ruined.
The flurry of punches had failed.
The Allied Supreme Commander, General Ferdinand Foch, recognized this strategic exhaustion immediately.
He saw that the German salient, the bulge they had created in the Allied lines, was deeply vulnerable.
So Foch ordered an immediate counteroffensive, resulting in a major Allied victory at the Second Battle of the Marne in late July.
That victory actually earned Foch a promotion to Marshal of France.
A fitting reward for turning the tide.
Definitely. Following that defeat at the Marne, the German forces were forced into a fighting withdrawal back toward the north.
But Foch understood that simply halting the German attack was not enough.
He needed to seize the initiative and permanently transition the Allied armies from a defensive posture into a relentless, coordinated offensive.
But the Allies couldn't just resort to the tactics of 1916.
Well,
They couldn't go back to the Battle of the Somme playbook, where they would bombard a trench line for a week and then send tens of thousands of infantrymen walking slowly across no man's land.
only to be butchered by surviving machine guns.
If they were going to counterattack at Amiens, they needed a completely new operational doctrine.
That brings us to the strategic masterminds who orchestrated this shift.
On July 23rd, fresh off the momentum of the Marne victory, Foch outlined his grand strategy.
His immediate priority was to reduce the various salients the Germans had carved into the lines.
Crucially, he wanted to push the Germans far enough back from Amiens to entirely free those vital railway lines from the constant threat of long-range German artillery fire.
Interestingly, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, alongside General Sir Henry Rawlinson of the British Fourth Army, had already been independently developing a plan for a major offensive in that exact sector.
When the British lines had stabilized back in April, Rawlinson's Fourth Army had taken over the front straddling the Somme River.
The deployment placed the British Third Corps under Lieutenant General Richard Butler north of the river.
And the Australian Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General John Monash, to the south.
We need to spend some time looking at Lieutenant General John Monash.
Yes, because the historical consensus in our sources points to him as the true tactical architect of the Amiens breakthrough.
A pivotal administrative change occurred on May 30th. All 5 Australian infantry divisions were united under a single corps headquarters, with Monash in command for the very first time.
Monash is a deeply compelling figure in military history.
He really is. Before the war, he was a civil engineer and a pioneer in reinforced concrete construction in Australia.
He brought that exact same meticulous mathematical engineering mindset to the battlefield.
He was not a member of the traditional aristocratic military establishment.
Field Marshal Haig, who was often highly critical of his subordinates, noted in his own diary that Monash had all the threads of the operation in his hands.
Monash viewed the traditional method of trench warfare, the endless, agonizing artillery bombardments, followed by waves of unprotected infantry, as intellectually bankrupt
and needlessly wasteful of human life.
His operational philosophy was radically modern.
Monash believed in relying on technology, supreme surprise, and above all, coordinated arms.
He envisioned a battlefield where tanks, airplanes, artillery, and infantry did not fight isolated battles,
but operated as one seamless, highly synchronized machine.
And Monash had already field-tested this exact philosophy.
Just 5 weeks prior to Amiens, on July 4th.
He orchestrated a localized, highly successful counterattack known as the Battle of Amiens.
The German defenders at Amiens were deeply entrenched in advantageous terrain with vast interlocking fields of machine gun fire.
These were the types of positions that had historically taken months and tens of thousands of lives to capture.
But at Amiens, Monash discarded the traditional playbook.
He didn't order days of preliminary artillery shelling, which would have only cratered the ground and warned the Germans an attack was imminent.
Instead, the artillery remained completely silent until the exact minute the infantry and the newly supplied tanks began moving forward together.
The coordination was so precise, and the surprise so total, that the German defenders were rapidly overrun with relatively minimal Allied casualties.
It was a flawless proof of concept.
The success at Amiens proved that the open, chalky terrain south of the Somme River was perfectly suited for a massive, large-scale offensive utilizing these combined arms tactics.
Consequently, General Rawlinson took Monash's proposals, expanded them, and submitted the grand plan to Haig in mid-July.
Haig then forwarded the concept to Marshal Foch.
But this planning phase was not without significant friction between the Allied commanders.
Rawlinson and Monash were absolutely adamant that the entire success of the Amiens operation hinged on achieving total, paralyzing surprise.
To do that, they planned to utilize armor on a scale never before seen.
By the summer of 1918, British factories were finally producing advanced tanks in large numbers.
The British commanders wanted to skip the preliminary artillery bombardment entirely, send hundreds of tanks crashing through the wire, and catch the German defenders completely unaware.
Foch, however, during a critical planning meeting on July 24th, agreed to the overall concept, but imposed one major condition.
He insisted that the French First Army, commanded by General Marie-Eugène Debenay, must participate in the attack.
The French First Army was holding the line immediately to the south of the British Fourth Army.
From Rawlinson's perspective, this presented a massive tactical problem.
The French First Army did not possess a fleet of heavy tanks.
If the French lacked armor to break the barbed wire and suppress the machine guns, they would have no choice but to rely on a traditional, hours-long artillery bombardment to soften up the German trenches before their infantry could advance.
And if the French started indiscriminately blasting the German lines with high explosives,
the element of surprise for the entire Allied line would vanish instantly.
every German unit in the sector would immediately know a major offensive was underway.
It was a profound strategic impasse.
The British reliance on technological surprise was clashing directly with the French reality of traditional infantry tactics.
However, they eventually negotiated a brilliant, synchronized compromise.
The French forces would indeed participate and secure the southern flank, but they would not fire a single artillery shell or launch their infantry assault until exactly 45 minutes after the British, Australian, and Canadian forces had already launched their surprise armored thrust.
It preserves the initial shock and awe for the main spearhead, while still bringing the immense weight of the French military into the engagement shortly after the chaos had already begun.
They also adjusted the timeline, pulling the date of the attack forward from August 10th to August 8th.
They wanted to strike while the German forces were still disorganized and attempting to dig in after their long, exhausting retreat from the Marne.
The operational blueprint was finalized. Rawlinson met with his corps commanders on July 21st to solidify the details.
You had Lieutenant General Butler commanding the British Third Corps, Monash with the Australians, Lieutenant General Charles Kavanagh commanding the Cavalry Corps, and Sir Arthur Currie leading the Canadian Corps.
This specific deployment is historically notable because it placed the highly regarded Australian Corps and the equally formidable Canadian Corps attacking shoulder to shoulder for the very first time.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because drafting a brilliant, technologically advanced plan in a chateau headquarters is one thing.
Actually executing it on the ground is a completely different universe.
Yeah. The logistics of hiding an army of hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of artillery pieces, and literally hundreds of massive, deafening tanks from an enemy entrenched just a few hundred yards away.
It requires a level of deception that is, frankly, difficult to comprehend.
We are looking at one of the most elaborate, multi-layered bluffs in military history.
Consider the logistical nightmare of moving the Canadian Corps alone.
You have 4 entire, fully equipped infantry divisions, roughly 100,000 men.
That need to be secretly transported from their positions near Arras, all the way down to the Amiens sector, without the German observation balloons or reconnaissance planes noticing a single thing.
The sources emphasize that pulling this off was a supreme testament to how highly evolved the staff work of the British armies had become by 1918.
They didn't just enforce strict blackout rules. They actively constructed a massive, complex diversion.
The Allied command took a tiny detachment from the Canadian Corps.
Just 2 infantry battalions, a wireless radio communications unit, and a casualty clearing station.
And they shipped them all the way north to the Ypres salient in Flanders, Belgium.
To understand why that specific location matters, we have to look at German intelligence estimates.
The German High Command knew an Allied attack was inevitable.
But they were trying to predict where the blow would fall.
They strongly suspected an offensive would come either further east near Reims or far to the north in Flanders, near Mount Kemmel.
By sending this highly visible, noisy Canadian detachment up to Flanders, the Allies were intentionally feeding the German intelligence apparatus exactly what they expected to see.
It functions like a massive sleight-of-hand trick.
The Canadian wireless unit up in Flanders starts broadcasting massive amounts of radio traffic.
The medics set up highly visible casualty clearing stations.
They make sure German spotters clearly see the distinct Canadian uniform insignia moving around the northern trenches.
They're actively waving a red flag up north to force the Germans to look the wrong way.
While the actual 100,000-man corps slips quietly into the southern Amiens sector.
And the discipline required to maintain this secrecy in the south was absolute.
Allied troops were strictly ordered to move only under the cover of darkness.
During daylight hours, they were hidden in woods and villages.
To further confuse any German observers who might notice movement, Allied troops would sometimes deliberately march in the wrong direction during the day,
only to turn around and march toward the front at night.
The written orders distributed to the troops included a stark, pasted-in warning, "Keep your mouth shut."
They went to incredible lengths to disguise the intent.
In the official planning documents and communications, the word offensive was strictly forbidden.
The entire massive operation was casually referred to as a localized raid.
The movement was so tightly controlled that the Canadian Corps wasn't even fully assembled in their final jumping-off positions until August 7th.
Literally hours before the attack was scheduled to commence.
While the infantry maneuvers were a masterclass in deception, the artillery plan is where the technological innovation truly shines.
If the core philosophy of the attack is absolute surprise, that presents a massive problem for the artillery batteries.
Historically, before launching a barrage, artillery units had to fire ranging shots.
They would fire a few shells, spotters would observe where those shells landed, and the gunners would adjust their aim to account for wind, temperature, and barrel wear.
But firing ranging shots acts as an immediate alarm bell to the enemy that their specific position is about to be attacked.
So the Allied command tasked Major General C.E.D. Budworth, the senior artillery officer for the Fourth Army, with devising a master fire plan that would be devastatingly accurate on the very first volley.
Without a single ranging shot being fired.
And the sheer volume of firepower we are talking about here is immense.
The Allies amassed 1,386 field guns and howitzers, backed up by 684 heavy guns.
That is 27 medium artillery brigades and 13 heavy batteries, all secretly moved into position.
To aim thousands of artillery pieces silently and accurately, Budworth relied heavily on a relatively new, highly mathematical technique known as sound ranging, coupled with meticulous aerial photography.
Sound ranging in 1918 was an incredibly complex process.
It involved placing a precisely measured array of specialized microphones along the front line, connected by miles of fragile wire to a central recording station equipped with an oscillograph.
Let's delve into how that actually worked in an era before digital computers.
When a concealed German artillery piece fired, the sound wave of the blast would travel across the battlefield and reach those different microphones at slightly different milliseconds.
By analyzing the film strips from the oscillograph and calculating those minute time differences,
while also factoring in the air temperature and wind speed of the day.
The Allied technicians could mathematically triangulate the exact coordinates of the enemy gun.
They combined that hard mathematical data with thousands of high-resolution photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft,
creating a hyper-accurate map of the German defenses.
Because of this painstaking scientific preparation, Budworth's master timetable allowed the Allied artillerymen to pre-target 504 out of the 530 known German artillery batteries in the sector.
They had the coordinates locked in, entirely in secret, ready to unleash hell at 0 hour.
We have to talk about the tanks.
Yes, because masking the movement of the armor might be the most fascinating logistical detail in these sources.
Almost 600 tanks were allocated for the Amiens offensive.
You had the heavy Mark V fighting tanks, the extended Mark V-star models designed to cross wider trenches,
unarmed supply tanks designed to carry ammunition,
and the faster, lighter medium Mark a Whippet tanks assigned to support the cavalry corps.
But a World War I tank is not a stealth vehicle.
Far from it. A Mark V tank weighed 29 tons and was powered by a massive 150 horsepower Ricardo engine.
The acoustic signature of just one of these machines echoing across the quiet pre-dawn countryside was deafening.
The sound of 600 of them rumbling toward the front lines, grinding their metal tracks through the mud, would easily alert every German sentry within a 5-mile radius that an armored assault was imminent.
So how do you hide the sound of a mechanical army?
The Allied planners came up with a brilliantly simple yet incredibly dangerous solution.
They decided to hide the noise of the tank engines using airplane engines.
They calculated that the twin-engine Handley Page 0400 heavy bombers used by the Royal Air Force had an acoustic profile that sounded remarkably similar to the deep rumble of a Mark V tank.
The plan was to launch these massive bombers and have them fly continuous, low-altitude patrols up and down the German lines throughout the night.
By deliberately flooding the battlefield with the droning noise of aircraft engines, they aimed to completely drown out and mask the mechanical clatter of the hundreds of tanks moving into their final assembly areas below.
But the weather almost derailed the entire deception.
On the night they needed to execute this sound masking operation, an unseasonably dense, heavy fog rolled in, blanketing the entire region.
The visibility dropped to near zero.
Flying a massive rudimentary bomber at low altitude in pitch-black fog with only 1918 navigation instruments was essentially a suicide mission.
The commanders of the two RAF squadrons assigned to the task felt the conditions were so hazardous they refused to officially order their pilots into the air.
Instead, they asked for volunteers.
2 men from 207 Squadron stepped forward to take the risk, Captain Gordon Flavel and Captain William Peace.
They volunteered to fly their Handley Page bombers through that blinding fog, weaving dangerously close to the ground, risking a fatal crash at any second, solely to generate the necessary noise.
Their immense bravery was absolutely critical to maintaining the secrecy of the entire Amiens offensive, and both men were later awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for their actions that night.
Even with the radio diversions, the sound ranging, and the bombers flying in the fog, the entire meticulously planned operation came within a hair's breadth of total disaster just 48 hours before it was supposed to begin.
On August 6th, the Allied command experienced a moment of sheer terror.
The German 27th Division, a highly elite and heavily armed Stoßtruppen formation, suddenly launched a fierce localized attack north of the Somme River.
This attack hit the exact sector where the Allied forces were secretly crammed together, massing for their own offensive.
The panic in the Allied headquarters must have been absolute.
The initial thought had to be that the deception had failed, the German spies had figured it out, and the enemy was launching a preemptive strike to ruin the buildup.
However, the historical records confirm that the German command was completely oblivious to the Allied buildup.
This sudden attack was merely a localized act of retaliation.
A week earlier, on the night of July 31st, the 5th Australian Division had conducted an aggressive trench raid north of the Somme, taking dozens of German prisoners.
The attack by the German 27th Division on August 6th was ordered solely as payback for that specific raid.
They did manage to penetrate roughly 800 yards into the Allied lines, causing chaos and casualties, but they had not uncovered the massive trap waiting for them.
What a heart-stopping coincidence.
The German shock troops eventually withdrew back to their original trench lines by the morning of August 7th, but the disruption forced the Allied commanders to scramble,
Redraw lines, and make frantic last-minute adjustments to their assembly areas.
It is a perfect reminder that no matter how brilliant your mathematical fire plan is, or how clever your airplane diversion is, the chaotic, unpredictable friction of war can always throw a massive wrench into the machinery.
But despite the anxiety, the secrecy held firm.
The German high command remained in the dark.
The Canadian troops were in position, the thousands of artillery pieces were locked onto their targets, and the hundreds of tanks were idling quietly in the unseasonably thick fog.
The timeline brings us to the early pre-dawn hours of August 8th, 1918.
The stage is set.
It is 4:20 a.m. A dense, freezing fog is clinging tightly to the ground, reducing visibility to mere yards.
Along the line of Rawlinson's Fourth Army, the British Third Corps is positioned north of the Somme River.
In the center, south of the river, waits the Australian Corps.
South of them, the Canadian Corps.
And further south, the French First Army is prepared to launch their delayed attack.
It is 0 hour.
At exactly 4:20 a.m., the eerie silence of the foggy morning is shattered with apocalyptic violence.
Over 2,000 Allied artillery pieces, guided entirely by Budworth's sound-ranging mathematics, opened fire simultaneously.
They deliberately avoided using massive quantities of poison gas shells in the days leading up to the attack,
Which was unusual for 1918.
because they wanted to ensure the Germans felt no sense of impending dread.
The shock was absolute, instantaneous, and completely overwhelming.
Let's try to visualize the sheer terror of this moment from the perspective of a German sentry.
You are standing in a freezing trench, surrounded by dense white fog. You can't see anything.
Without a single warning shot, the earth simply erupts.
500 of your own artillery batteries, the guns you rely on for protection, are violently destroyed in a single synchronized strike.
And then, out of that blinding mist, monstrous shapes begin to emerge.
Hundreds of 29-ton tanks moving relentlessly forward, followed immediately by tens of thousands of Allied infantrymen advancing tight behind a creeping barrage.
We should detail what a creeping barrage actually entails, because it requires incredibly difficult coordination.
The Allied artillery was not firing at stationary targets anymore.
They were firing a continuous wall of high explosive and shrapnel shells that advanced at a precise mathematical rate.
Usually about 100 yards every 3 minutes.
The Allied infantry were trained to walk dangerously close behind this advancing wall of explosions.
The goal was to force the German defenders to stay hiding deep inside their dugouts until the barrage passed over them.
At which point, the Allied infantry would immediately be on top of the trench before the Germans could even man their machine guns.
The psychological and physical shock was so profound that it took the surviving German forces a full 5 minutes to organize themselves enough to even begin returning artillery fire.
And the sources point out in incredible detail about the speed of this advance.
When the German artillery finally did manage to fire back, they aimed their shells at the known Allied assembly points in forward trenches.
But the Allied forces were moving so rapidly behind that creeping barrage that those assembly areas were already completely empty.
The German artillery was furiously bombing empty mud.
In the first phase of the assault alone, 7 entire divisions surged forward into the fog.
You had the British 18th and 58th Divisions, the Australian 2nd and 3rd, and the Canadian 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Divisions.
Additionally, elements of the 33rd Infantry Division of the U.S. Army National Guard were attached to support the British forces in the difficult northern sector.
The forward momentum was simply unstoppable.
By 7:30 a.m., just 3 hours and 10 minutes after the very first shot was fired, the attacking forces had completely captured the entirety of the first German defensive position.
They had advanced nearly 4 kilometers, or about 2.5 miles, into enemy territory.
In the center of the line, the supporting units effortlessly pushed through the lead elements to attack the second tier of objectives, another 2 miles further deep.
The Australian units secured their first targets by 7:10 a.m., and barely an hour later, the 4th and 5th Australian Divisions, alongside the Canadian 4th Division, had passed entirely through the initial breach and were operating in open country.
The combined arms synergy was operating flawlessly.
The original battle plan actually called for the third phase of the attack to be carried out by infantry who were physically riding inside the newly designed Mark 5-star tanks.
These tanks had been elongated specifically to carry troops across the massive anti-tank trenches of the Hindenburg Line.
But the frontline infantry was advancing with such relentless, aggressive speed that they largely ignored the tanks and secured the final objectives completely on foot.
Because the Allies had ripped such a massive hole completely through the deep German defenses, they were able to unleash the cavalry.
A unit that had been largely useless during years of static trench warfare.
They sent a cavalry brigade charging into the Australian sector, and 2 full cavalry divisions poured into the Canadian sector, exploiting the open ground.
And in the skies above, the newly formed Royal Air Force was flying low-level sorties, strafing retreating German columns and preventing the enemy commanders from organizing any sort of coherent secondary defense.
We must also account for the French First Army on the southern flank.
They initiated their preliminary artillery bombardment right at 4:20 a.m., as agreed, hammering the German positions for 3 hours and 20 minutes.
Once the shock had set in, the French 9th Corps and 31st Corps rolled forward.
They swiftly captured the town of Moreuil by 9:30 a.m., took Mézières, and occupied Fresnoy by 9 o'clock.
When you look at the timeline, the speed of this operation is simply absurd by the grim standards of World War I.
We are discussing a conflict where armies would regularly fight for 6 straight months, enduring hundreds of thousands of casualties, just to move the front line a few miserable miles.
But on the morning of August 8th, the Canadian and Australian forces in the center of the attack advanced 3 miles from their starting positions before 11 a.m.
There is a remarkably telling anecdote in the sources that perfectly captures the sheer velocity of the Allied breakthrough.
The advance was so rapid and unprecedented that an entire party of high-ranking German officers and divisional staff were taken prisoner by Allied troops while they were literally sitting at a table eating their morning breakfast.
They were miles behind what they assumed was the front line.
They had absolutely no idea the defensive perimeter had been obliterated and that the enemy was already operating deep in their rear areas.
By the time the sun set on that first day, the Allies had punched a catastrophic hole in the German lines south of the Somme River.
A gap 24 kilometers long, that is 15 miles of front line, was torn completely open.
Let's examine the concrete data from day one, because the numbers paint an incredibly stark picture of just how one-sided this mechanized breakthrough was.
On average, the Allied forces penetrated 11 kilometers, or nearly 7 miles, deep into enemy territory in a single day.
Breaking those numbers down by sector, the Canadian Corps achieved the deepest penetration, advancing 13 kilometers.
The Australian Corps gained 11 kilometers.
The French forces gained 8 kilometers.
And the British forces, fighting through heavily cratered and difficult terrain north of the Somme, gained about 3.2 kilometers.
In total, the Allied armies captured over 15,000 German prisoners on August 8th alone.
15,000 men choosing to surrender in a span of hours.
And the overall casualty figures are equally striking.
The total German losses for that single day were estimated to be around 30,000 men killed, wounded, or captured.
In stark contrast, the massive Allied assault force suffered only around 12,000 casualties.
It was a sweeping, historic, tactical victory.
However, what secures the Battle of Amiens its legendary status in history isn't merely the sheer acreage of physical territory recaptured, or even the devastating casualty ratios.
It was the profound, irreversible psychological devastation this defeat inflicted upon the German high command and the average soldiers shivering in the trenches.
Physical ground can be lost in a war, and it can be won back a week later.
But when the fundamental fighting spirit of an army is broken, it is a catastrophic injury from which a military force rarely recovers.
General Erich Ludendorff, the quartermaster general and effectively the commander of the German military effort, recognized this instantly.
In his memoirs, he famously designated August 8th as the Schwarzer Tag des Deutschen Heeres.
The Black Day of the German Army.
And reading his accounts, Ludendorff made it explicitly clear why he chose that somber title.
He wasn't despairing over the miles of French farmland they had lost to the advancing tanks.
He called it the Black Day because on that morning he realized the underlying morale of the German soldier had completely and utterly evaporated.
It sank to a terrifying nadir, where massive formations of troops weren't fighting to the death and they weren't executing organized fighting retreats.
They were simply throwing down their weapons and capitulating.
5 entire German divisions were effectively engulfed, neutralized, and wiped off the order of battle in hours.
The primary sources detail a complete breakdown in fundamental military discipline that is chilling to read.
We are not just discussing exhausted men fleeing from tanks. We are looking at accounts of brazen, open mutiny occurring directly on the battlefield.
As defeated, demoralized German troops were streaming backward away from the advancing Allied armor. They were actively turning on their own officers who were desperately attempting to rally them.
They were shouting, "You're prolonging the war," directly at their commanders.
That specific phrase, prolonging the war, signals a massive psychological paradigm shift.
When a soldier yells that at their own commanding officer, they no longer view the conflict as a patriotic struggle for national survival or victory.
They view the war purely as a senseless, unwinnable meat grinder.
And more importantly, they view their own officers not as leaders to be followed, but as the cruel architects forcing them to remain inside that machine.
The animosity extended even further.
When those retreating soldiers passed by fresh German reserve troops who were marching forward to the front lines to try and plug the massive 15-mile gap, the retreating men hurled furious insults at them.
They literally called their own reinforcements blacklegs,
which is a highly loaded term.
Blackleg is traditionally used in a civilian labor dispute to describe a strikebreaker, a scab.
By using that specific word, the retreating soldiers were essentially making a unified declaration.
We have gone on strike. We refuse to participate in this war anymore.
And by marching up here to fight, you are breaking our strike and keeping this horror going.
When an imperial army begins viewing its military service through the lens of a hostile labor strike against its own government, the war is, in their minds, definitively over.
General Paul von Hindenburg, the legendary chief of the German General Staff, offered his own grim, analytical assessment of the disaster.
He pointed to how completely the Allies had managed to dismantle the German command and control infrastructure.
Hindenburg recognized that the sheer velocity of the Allied armored advance, combined with Bugworth's incredibly precise artillery strikes on communication nodes, had physically isolated the German command posts.
The commanders sitting in the rear echelons literally had no idea the front line had collapsed until Allied tanks were practically driving past their windows.
The telephone wires were shredded, runners couldn't make it through the barrage, and as a result, the command structure was paralyzed.
They couldn't issue orders to fall back, they couldn't coordinate defensive artillery, and they were completely incapable of organizing any effective localized counterattacks.
It was a total systems failure of both military infrastructure and human morale.
It was the definitive turning point of the conflict.
But as military history consistently demonstrates, war is rarely a neat cinematic narrative where one side executes a flawless victory and the conflict neatly concludes the following day.
As the sun set on the Black Day and the Allied commanders prepared to push their advantage into Day 2, the brutal, grinding friction of war began to fiercely reassert itself.
The second phase of the battle, running from August 9th through the 12th, which included the Battle of Montdidier in the south, was a drastically different, much uglier story.
The spectacular, fluid, mechanized advance of that first morning rapidly began to bog down, and it slowed down for a very pragmatic, unavoidable reason.
The nightmare of logistics.
The very speed that made the first 24 hours so historically successful became a critical liability onto Day 2.
The Allied infantry and armor had pushed so far, so aggressively deep into German territory, that they simply outran their own supporting artillery network.
You cannot quickly drag heavy multi-ton howitzers through miles of newly captured, heavily cratered, mud-soaked battlefields at the same speed a soldier can sprint.
And without that protective umbrella of heavy artillery cover, the advancing infantry once again became highly vulnerable to entrenched German machine guns.
The road networks were an absolute disaster, too.
On the Canadian front, the few intact roads became paralyzed by unbelievable congestion.
You had fresh troops trying to march forward, supplies supply wagons hauling ammunition, thousands of wounded men being evacuated back to the rear, and massive columns of German prisoners being marched away from the front.
It created a monumental traffic jam.
The British 32nd Division, which was ordered to push forward rapidly to maintain the momentum of the attack, simply got stuck in the gridlock.
They physically could not reach the front lines fast enough to exploit the gaps.
Furthermore, we have to critically examine the mechanical attrition rate of the armored forces.
This specific data point is staggering and vital to understanding the era.
We established that the Allies launched the Amiens offensive with a formidable force of nearly 600 tanks, which were absolutely instrumental in crushing the barbed wire and breaking the lines on August 8th.
Within just 4 days of continuous combat operations, out of those 500-plus forward-fighting tanks, only 6 individual machines were still considered battle-ready.
6. From over 500 fighting tanks down to 6 in less than a week.
That is a completely unimaginable attrition rate.
It perfectly encapsulates the extreme technological limitations of 1918.
Tanks were a revolutionary concept. They represented an absolute paradigm shift for breaking the deadlock of trench warfare.
But mechanically, they were incredibly unreliable, rudimentary beasts.
The environment inside a Mark V was hellish. Temperatures reached well over 100 degrees, the air was thick with toxic carbon monoxide from the exposed engine, and the deafening noise made communication impossible.
Beyond the sheer exhaustion of the crews, the massive engines constantly broke down, the metal tracks snapped in the deep mud, and because they moved at a walking pace, they were prime, highly visible targets for concentrated German field artillery.
The harsh battlefield environment simply devoured the machinery.
And as the armored momentum stalled and the tanks broke down, the fighting reverted to the incredibly bloody, static nature the troops knew all too well.
Up north, in the sector assigned to the British Third Corps, there was a specific punishing piece of geography that turned into an absolute nightmare for the Allied advance.
It was called the Chipilly Spur.
Chipilly Ridge was a bare, prominent, 75-foot-high chalk ridge located inside a deep, winding oxbow bend of the Somme River, situated near the small village of Chipilly.
The British forces had failed to capture it on the initial thrust of August 8th due to the exceedingly rough terrain and the fact that they were only allocated a single tank battalion for support in that northern sector.
Because it was elevated 75 feet above the surrounding river valley, the ridge provided the German defenders with a sweeping, commanding view over a vast expanse of the battlefield.
The German machine gunners and artillery observers were sitting highly elevated on this ridge, looking directly down across the river valley, and pouring a devastating, unceasing volume of fire directly down onto the Australian Corps, who were completely pinned down near a place called Hamel.
The Australians were trapped. They literally couldn't move out of their shallow trenches without getting immediately cut to pieces by plunging fire.
The Allies desperately had to take that ridge to relieve the pressure, but the British forces in that sector were exhausted, depleted, and heavily bogged down.
Consequently, the desperate, brutal job of assaulting Chipilly Ridge was handed over to the Americans.
Specifically, 3 battalions of American infantrymen, often referred to as doughboys, from the 33rd U.S. Infantry Division.
These were primarily National Guard troops who had been temporarily attached to support the British operations.
The accounts of this specific assault are incredibly intense.
At 5:30 p.m. on the evening of August 9th, these American troops initiate their attack.
They are ordered to march directly up this bare, chalky ridge, completely exposed to the enemy, while heavy German machine gun and artillery fire is continuously plunging down on them from the entrenched positions at the summit.
Despite taking heavy casualties, they refused to break or be driven back down the hill.
Drawing from the sources, specifically referencing the historical analysis by author B.J. Omenson, the American forces repeatedly pressed the grueling assault until they finally managed to secure the northern half of the ridge, as well as the southern extremity of a nearby heavily fortified area known as Grisere Wood.
They did not halt their momentum there. They continued pressing the brutal, close-quarters combat into the following day, eventually capturing the entirety of Grisere Wood from the German defenders.
By the time the American assault concluded, they had captured 700 German prisoners, seized 30 heavy artillery pieces, secured an enemy airplane, and confiscated more than 100 deadly machine guns.
But this victory required a massive toll in human life and endurance.
And this specific engagement brings us to one of the most remarkable, deeply personal stories of the entire offensive.
The heroism of Corporal Jake Alex.
Corporal Alex's story perfectly illuminates the deeply human individual element that exists amidst all this grand, sweeping military strategy.
Jake Alex was an immigrant, born in Kosovo, Serbia. He traveled to the United States and found himself fighting in a U.S. Army uniform as part of the 33rd Division.
During the absolute chaos and carnage of the uphill assault on Chipilly Ridge, his platoon was being decimated by an entrenched German machine gun nest that was halting the advance.
The situation becomes catastrophic. Every single commanding officer in his platoon is killed or severely wounded in the relentless crossfire.
So Jake Alex, an immigrant corporal, steps up into the leadership vacuum and assumes total command of the surviving men.
He leads them in a direct, desperate, frontal charge against that firing machine gun nest.
According to his official citation, during that ferocious charge, he personally killed 5 enemy soldiers and captured 15 prisoners, violently silencing the gun that was destroying his unit.
His actions under such extreme duress were so extraordinary and so tactically critical to the overall success of capturing the ridge and relieving the pinned-down Australian forces across the river that Corporal Jake Alex was awarded the Medal of Honor.
To put that into perspective, he became only the 2nd American soldier to earn the Medal of Honor during the entirety of the First World War.
It's an astonishing narrative that highlights the deeply international, complexly interwoven nature of this specific battle.
You have an immigrant from Kosovo wearing the uniform of the United States, taking command in the chaos of an assault on a French ridge, fighting a German machine gun crew, specifically to save the lives of Australian soldiers who are pinned down across the river valley.
It is a vivid snapshot of what it means to fight a true world war.
It truly is. And the successful capture of Chipilly Ridge essentially shattered the last major cohesive sticking point of the German defensive line in that immediate sector.
By August 10th, the Allied reconnaissance planes and forward observers were reporting clear, undeniable signs that the German army was abandoning their positions and pulling out of the entire salient they'd so bloodily carved out during Operation Michael.
They were in full retreat.
By August 13th, even operating with almost 0 functional tanks left to support the infantry, the British forces had managed to drive a staggering 12 miles deep into the former German positions.
Officially, by August 27th, command reports stated the Allies had captured nearly 50,000 German prisoners and over 500 artillery pieces in the Amiens sector.
But at this crucial juncture, Field Marshal Haig makes a highly significant strategic decision regarding the future of the campaign.
Marshal Foch, acting as the Supreme Allied Commander, was determined to keep aggressively pushing the Amiens offensive forward, desperate to squeeze every last drop of territorial gain and momentum out of the retreating Germans.
But Haig firmly refused the request. He possessed a clear-eyed understanding of the tactical reality on the ground.
His troops were deeply exhausted, the logistical supply lines were dangerously strained, the tank corps was non-existent, and the vital element of surprise was completely gone.
Instead of grinding his men into dust against the rapidly hardening secondary German defensive lines, Haig preferred to halt the Amiens operation, shift the focus entirely, and launch a fresh, massive offensive with General Julian Byng's Third Army further north, in the sector between the Anker and the Scarpe rivers.
That strategic pivot kicked off the Second Battle of the Somme on August 21st.
But even as the localized Battle of Amiens officially wrapped up, its impact on the trajectory of the war was absolute and permanent.
The fundamental tempo of the conflict had irreversibly changed.
It had changed completely. Amiens marks the definitive death knell of the static, unimaginative trench warfare that had stubbornly defined the Western Front ever since the race to the sea in the autumn of 1914.
When both armies initially tried to outflank each other, digging trenches all the way from the Swiss border to the English Channel.
Mobile, combined arms warfare had officially returned to the battlefield.
Monash and the Allied command proved that if you utilized armor in mass quantities, precisely synchronized with creeping artillery barrages, relentless air support, and highly motivated infantry, you could successfully rupture the deepest, most complex defensive lines imaginable.
The British war correspondent Philip Gibbs was actually present on the battlefield, and he wrote a dispatch on August 27th that perfectly captures the profound shift in the atmosphere.
He observed that the operational initiative was now so completely in Allied hands that they were able to strike the enemy at multiple different locations entirely at will.
But his most astute, enduring observation was regarding the mindset of the men. He wrote, "The change has been greater in the minds of men than in the taking of territory."
Gibbs recognized a fundamental truth of conflict. The true victory wasn't the 12 miles of recaptured, ruined French mud. It was the monumental psychological shift.
He noted that the Allied troops, who had been battered for years, were suddenly buoyed by an enormous, palpable hope that they could finally get on with this business quickly and end the war.
Conversely, he observed that the German forces no longer possessed even a dim, flickering hope of achieving victory on the Western Front.
As Gibbs bluntly put it, all the German army hoped for now was to defend themselves long enough to compel a peace by negotiation. Amiens forced the German high command to confront their inevitable defeat.
The sheer magnitude and strategic brilliance of what was achieved at Amiens resulted in an unprecedented wave of honors and decorations.
On August 12th, while the second phase of the battle was still technically underway, King George V actually traveled across the Channel to the battlefield.
He formally knighted Lieutenant General John Monash, the primary architect of the mechanized attack, investing him as a Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath, right there in the field amidst the troops.
That was an incredibly rare, historically significant honor.
The sources indicate it was the first time a British monarch had knighted a military commander on an active battlefield in 200 years.
It speaks volumes about how heavily the British leadership valued Monash's brilliant, unorthodox planning and flawless execution.
The immense courage of the individual soldiers fighting in the mud was recognized on a massive scale as well.
8 Canadian soldiers were awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest award for gallantry, for their incredible actions during the Battle of Amiens, including men like Private John Croke, Corporal Harry Minor, and Lieutenant Jean Brilliant.
But one specific story from the Australian ranks really stands out in the historical record: the story of Alfred Gabby.
Alfred Gabby's story serves as a profound, heartbreaking example of the bittersweet reality of this conflict.
On the very first morning, August 8th, Gabby was acting as the commander of his unit when their rapid advance was suddenly halted by a large, heavily armed German force positioned about 40 yards beyond a dense wire obstacle.
His unit is pinned down under heavy, concentrated machine gun and rifle fire.
Gabby manages to find a small gap in the barbed wire. He approaches the enemy strongpoint completely single-handedly, maneuvering under a hail of bullets, and empties his revolver directly into the German garrison.
He physically drives the surviving crews away from their weapons, capturing 50 enemy soldiers and 4 heavy machine guns entirely by himself.
He earns the Victoria Cross for this act of absolute, unimaginable valor on what was the greatest day of advance in the entire war.
But tragically, the war did not end on the afternoon of August 8th.
Just 3 days later, on August 11th, while leading his men in an assault on a town called Lyons, Alfred Gabby was shot and killed by a random enemy sniper.
It is a stark, grounding reminder. It pulls this grand, sweeping narrative of a massive, strategic, empire-toppling victory back down into the brutal, fragile, deeply individual reality of the soldiers fighting on the ground.
A man can achieve the highest possible valor, single-handedly change the course of a local engagement, and still fall victim to a single, anonymous bullet just days later.
It is a deeply sobering reality. And precisely because of the dramatic, emotional highs and the devastating lows of this offensive, the Battle of Amiens has left a massive, enduring footprint in our cultural memory.
Even over a century later, the events of August 8th continue to be explored and represented across popular culture.
We see the battle represented across widely different mediums. In the digital sphere, the video game Battlefield 1 features Amiens as a major, highly detailed map for modes like Conquest and Rush, and it serves as a pivotal part of the game's Kaiserschlag operation.
The developers attempted to visually capture the intense, urban, and trench combat characteristic of that specific offensive.
It also serves as a major dramatic plot point in television. If you have ever watched the historical drama Downton Abbey, Season 2, Episode 5 revolves entirely around the events of the Battle of Amiens.
It depicts the battle where the central character, Matthew Crawley, is severely injured and paralyzed by an artillery shell, and where the young footman, William Mason, is tragically killed while heroically throwing himself in front of Matthew to shield him from the blast.
And in literature, the sheer sensory horror and geographic chaos of the battle was brilliantly immortalized by the American war poet, Lieutenant John Allen Wyeth.
Wyeth was a fascinating figure, a Princeton graduate educated in languages and literature who found himself serving as a soldier in the 33rd U.S. Division.
On the rainy, pitch-black night of August 8th, as the American forces were moving into their forward positions to eventually assault the Chipilly Ridge we discussed earlier, Wyeth and another lieutenant, Thomas J. Cochran, were assigned an incredibly dangerous, almost impossible mission.
They were ordered to deliver highly classified, sealed operational orders from the division headquarters located at Moulin-en-Bois, all the way forward to the field headquarters of the 3 specific battalions tasked with the attack.
And the terrifying part is, command didn't even know exactly where those battalions were currently located.
Wyeth and Cochrane just knew the battalions were somewhere in the darkness near the ruined village of Sailly-le-Sec on the north bank of the Somme River.
Wyeth later channeled this harrowing, deeply traumatic experience of wandering blindly through a dark, chaotic, corpse-strewn battlefield into a brilliant sequence of poetry.
In his 1928 literary work, This Man's Army, he composed 6 intricately interlinked sonnets that became known as the Chipilly Ridge sonnets.
The literary critic B.J. Omenson powerfully described Wyeth's sequence as capturing a soldier's stumblings through the metaphoric valley of death.
Wyeth's poetry doesn't just list the historical facts, it dives deeply into the crushing psychological and sensory nature of navigating an active war zone at night.
He describes the blinding chalk dust, the overwhelming smell of cordite and death, the sudden terrifying flashes of artillery illuminating the ruins, and the profound, isolating fear of stepping into the unknown darkness while the machinery of war grinds all around you.
It serves as a vital historical counterweight to the neat, clinical lines drawn on the general's tactical maps, reminding us of the visceral, terrifying reality experienced by the men tasked with actually executing the breakthrough.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the historical sources, let's look at the massive takeaways we've uncovered today.
We witnessed an entire Allied military apparatus shift away from a stubborn, unimaginative, bloody war of attrition to a dynamic doctrine based entirely on speed, new technology, and unbelievable multisensory deception.
We saw the absolute mastery of logistics orchestrated by John Monash, the wild, desperate ingenuity of masking deafening tank engines with heavy bombers flying blindly through the fog, and the definitive birth of modern combined arms warfare.
But above all, we witnessed the complete, irreversible collapse of the German fighting spirit.
If we synthesize everything we've analyzed in these sources today, the ultimate victor at Amiens wasn't simply the invention of the tank or the airplane or the complex mathematics of sound-ranging artillery.
The technology was absolutely crucial, yes, but the true victor was unprecedented coordination.
It was the remarkable ability of the Allied command to take French, British, Canadian, Australian, and American forces, along with infantrymen, armor crews, airmen, and artillerymen, and compel them all to act together as a single, devastating, synchronized organism.
That precise level of complex cooperation is what finally shattered the Western Front.
It stands as an incredible historical and logistical achievement.
But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today as we conclude. When General Ludendorff sat down in his headquarters and officially declared August 8th the Black Day of the German Army, he wasn't staring at a tactical map.
He wasn't mourning the loss of 12 miles of ruined French mud, or even lamenting the loss of 500 artillery guns.
He was looking directly into the faces of his own exhausted men. He was listening to the reports of them actively yelling strikebreaker at their own reinforcements.
It raises a truly fascinating, enduring question about the very nature of human conflict.
How much of a war is actually fought in the physical world of muddy trenches, rusted barbed wire, and artillery shells, and how much of it is actually fought and ultimately decided deep inside the complex architecture of the human mind?
Because Amiens conclusively proves that when the fundamental belief in victory finally dies, when the psychological will of a soldier to continue the struggle simply evaporates, the war is already over, no matter how many bullets you still have left in your gun.
A profoundly important point to end on.
Indeed.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the historical sources. Keep exploring the past, keep questioning the narratives, and we will see you next time as we uncover another fascinating turning point in history.